Good morning, everyone. Wherever you are, have a good day, everyone. Just give us a few minutes. We'll have people just populating the space and we will get going. Thank you all for being here. Just give us a couple of minutes.
I'm hidden.
Nope, you're not. You're actually on. Right. So we have a lot of people this morning. I'm assuming that some of you are from United States, all over United States, and we hope that we have international people. Certainly, it's a pleasure to be. I want to say it's a pleasure to meet you, and in virtual, but in person. I've been a fan of yours since I was a student, and my background is in management, and I've taught engineering, and I hope that our engineering students, learn a lot from you, and we teach about stakeholder theory, and I hope that they learn from you again today. So I'll begin. So welcome everyone to the Online Ethics Center Spring 2025 webinar series, Bringing Ethics into the Conversation. My name is Azita Hirsa, and I'm a senior lecturer at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute School of Engineering, Industrial and Systems Engineering Department, where I teach courses in management of engineering and technology, ethics of modeling, engineering ethics, and enhancing critical thinking for engineers, as well as professional development, technical issues and solutions. I'm the past chair of the Ethics Division at the American Society of Engineering Education, ASEE, host of the Leaders in Action Conversations at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and thrilled to be a webinar host for OEC since fall of 2023. The Online Ethics Center, hosted at the University of Virginia, is a digital repository for resources on teaching and learning about ethics in engineering and science. The OEC also fosters a community of faculty, students, researchers, and other professionals who come together to discuss ethics. Please check out our website at onlineethics.org. Since 2023, we have engaged with industry leaders and academic experts to discuss engineering ethics and ethical behavior in organizations, working to bridge the gap between academic research and real-world practice. I'm delighted to host our speaker today, R. Edward Freeman, is a university professor, distinguished chair in business administration professor, Olson professor and academic director of the Institute for Business and Society at the University of Virginia Darden School of Business. He is best known for his award-winning book, Strategic Management, A Stakeholder Approach, Pittman, 1984, and reprinted by Cambridge University Press in 2010. His latest books are Edward Freeman's selected works on stakeholder theory and ethics with Sergei Dmitriev, Spring Nature, 2023. Defeating with Andrew Sell, Columbia University Press, forthcoming in 2024. Models of Leadership in Plato and Beyond with Dominic Scott, Oxford 21. Humanizing Business with Michel Dion and Sergei Dmitriev, Springer Nature 2022, The Power of And, which is one of my favorite books now, Responsible Business Without Trade-Offs with Bidan Parmar and Kristen Martin, Columbia 2020, The Cambridge Handbook of Stakeholder Theory with Jeffrey Harrison, Jay Barney and Robert Phillips, Cambridge 2019, and Research Approaches to Business Ethics and Corporate Responsibility with Patricia Wehrhan and Sergei Dmitriev, Cambridge 2017. He has received 7 honorary doctorates from HEC Paris in France, Radboud University in Netherlands, Universidad Pontificia Camillus in Spain, the Hanken School of Economics, the Temper University in Finland, Sherbrooke University in Canada, and Lupana University in Germany for his work on stakeholder theory and business ethics. In 2022, he received the University of Virginia's most prestigious award, the Thomas Jefferson Award for Scholarship. Freeman served as co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Business Ethics, one of the leading journals in business ethics, from 2016 to 2020. He is a lifelong student of philosophy, martial arts, and the blues. Freeman is a founding member of Red Goat Records, bringing the joy of original soul and rhythm and blues, rhythm and blues music into the 21st century. He's the host of the Stakeholder podcast, another one of my favorites, sponsored by Stakeholder Media LLC. After Dr. Freeman's talk, we will take questions. To ask a question, please type in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen rather than the chat box. I'll read it to him. Audience members will not be able to use their mics or cameras. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. We have 153 folks in the room. Dr. Freeman, it's a pleasure, and the mic is all yours.
Thank you very much, Azita. It's a real pleasure to be with you here today and to be a part of this really groundbreaking program. I have enjoyed since I've been at UVA for, I don't know, seems like forever, but 38 years, to often spend time in the engineering school. And I think the engineering school here, as I assume others do, have a real sort of humanities part of their program, which is really terrific. We have taught courses there, kind of foundations of business, but not foundations of business that's the kind of normal just economics. We've taught it with kind of ethics at the center. And that's been a fun thing to do as well. So I'm very honored to be here, and hopefully what I want to do is cause those of you that are listening to think about things maybe in a different way. I'm going to admit right away that I'm pretty naive in it when it comes to technology. Generally, my sense of dealing with technology is to call one of my children and to have them tell me how to deal with it. But I've tried to think about this in a broader sense. We've also just started an institute here called the La Crosse Institute for uh, uh, Ethical AI. And I think the challenges in front of us are substantial. So I took the liberty of adding a word to the title. I would call this the mysterious, or hopefully we're going to get rid of some of that mysteriousness, relationship between technology, business, and ethics, because I think all three of those have to be important. So just briefly, what I'm going to do, and hopefully I'll save a lot of time for your questions. And if we don't get to your questions in the session, please feel free to just email them to me if you want to have some conversation. I would be happy to do that. I'm going to talk about this relationship between business, technology, and ethics, and then I'm going to talk about what I think is a different way to think about business that stakeholder theory does. I'm going to talk a little bit about a different way to think about ethics. As a philosopher, I'm a pragmatist, and that's generally a little bit different way to think about ethics. And then I'm going to finally talk about how do we connect technology to both of those, to both of those things. So to start, it seems to me that technology is mediated by business. So business mediates the relationship between technology and ethics. What do I mean by that? Well, what gets developed and how it gets developed is often a business issue. Now, so we need to understand how business really works. And let me be clear, when I say it's a business issue, I don't mean it's just about the money. And I'll come to that in just a minute. Now, often other stakeholders are involved as well, and then that's what makes it a business issue, really. The second thing is that so we have these three things together. The second thing is that we often ethically evaluate new technology after the fact. We sort of say, "Oh, I didn't know that was going to happen." You see this all the time with things like social media and others. This is what philosophers would call a horse barn door problem, and it's hard to get the horse back in the barn if you've ever chased any around the field, as I have. And so the question I have is, can we find a way to change this process or make it less useful in the way that we ethically, or sorry, make it more useful and less harmful as we think about how to put ethics and technology together. Well, unfortunately, I think we have some ideas about ethics that are not very useful. So I guess I would kick this off by saying, of this phrase business ethics, we only misunderstand two of the words. And I want to start by thinking about business for a few minutes. I'll get to technology and the relationship, but I don't think we can have a good conversation about that without understanding, at least for me, what I think of when I think about business. There's an old story about business, and you all know what it is. It says business about the money. It's about making money for owners or shareholders. Shareholders are not owners, but people think they are. And business works because of our desire to compete with each other. You know, nature red in tooth and claw describes us as human beings. And by the way, people, for the most part, will only do things if they're incentivized to do them. Incentivized in terms of their short-term economic self-interest. Um, Maybe this story has been useful at some point in the past. I tend to doubt it, but maybe it has. But it's certainly not useful now. We've had a perfect storm about this in the world. Well, think about the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, where we came close to bringing the world to the edge of financial ruin. We still have knock-on effects of those of that. That's still going. And if you think about in the U.S. at least, um, things like the George Floyd murder, things like the Me Too movement, we've had a new sort of understanding and a new awakening of of racial and gender and ethnic discrimination. So much so that we see a backlash to that today. And it's not just in the U.S. This sort of thing just happening all over the world. Um, and when you think about the effects of social media, you think about the effects of economic inequality. Again, these things are happening all over the world. You see this perfect storm, and now you say, well, business is just about the money. That doesn't help very much. It doesn't tell businesses how to deal with these societal issues. We've seen governments fractured around the world and are unable to deal with them very effectively. And now, just in case this wasn't enough for you, let's put a pandemic on it and see what happens. And so the old story of business, again, if it was ever effective, is just not relevant in the way today. Well, of course, money's important, but it's not the only thing. And the good news is that there are many companies around the world, and here I mean thousands and thousands of companies around the world that are rewriting this old story. They're realizing that business is more than just about the money, more than just about economics. And some of these companies are startups. Some of them have grown from startups, like one of my favorites, Whole Foods Markets. But others are large established companies, like a retailer called the Gap, or a Bank of America, or uh, uh, you know, consumer product companies as well. And they've kind of thought about a little more deeply about what business is. And I think there are kind of five things that businesses we need to take on. We need to take on in addition or with this idea that technology and ethics have to be connected. Um, and I'm going to just briefly talk about these five things. The first is that the old story gets purpose wrong. It says the purpose of a business is to make money and to make money for shareholders, and that's not right. Um, I need red blood cells to live, but it doesn't follow that the purpose of life is to make red blood cells. Businesses must have profits to live. The idea, primarily on the left, that profits are somehow evil or bad, that's a silly idea. Uh, businesses have to have profits or they can't. They can't live. But purpose is something else. Purpose is what gets you out of bed in the morning. Purpose is for a company, why it exists and why should anybody care? Purpose is about trying to figure out what you're going to do that's going to make a difference in the world. Entrepreneurs don't start companies because they want to make as much money as they can. When I have students who come to me and say, "Hey, I'm going to start a business. I got a great idea. We're gonna ramp it up, and then we're gonna flip it, and I'm gonna be like, really rich." I tell them, if you want to get really rich, you really should get a job because starting a business is very hard. Entrepreneurs start a business because they see the world differently. They got something, and they want to bring that something, that vision in their head to the world. I have a friend who started a restaurant in Copenhagen called Noma. Noma was, for many years, it closed not too long ago, seen as the best restaurant in the world. And he said, we didn't start Noma to make as much money as we could because we didn't make any money for the first 19 years. So purpose is equally important as profits. And again, the idea that profits are bad is not a very good idea. But the idea that profits are the only thing that matters, which is often comes from the right, is kind of equally bad. It's purpose and profits, and the power of and that book that Azita liked so much. So thank you very much for that. Um, what we tried to do was say, let's take the old story, let's don't throw it out. Let's figure out what's good about it, what needs to be added. So it's not just profits, it's purpose and profits. Second idea is stakeholders and financiers. Financiers, shareholders, banks, whoever is putting up the money for their company. Look, companies have always created value and sometimes destroyed it for customers, suppliers, employees, communities, people with money. That's what businesses do. It's hard to see how they could do anything else than that. That's just the unit of analysis that's there. And yes, shareholders or financiers are very important, but so are the other stakeholders as well. I was recently in a conversation at dinner with a former congressman, and he said to me, he said, "Well, suppose Ed, suppose I only just care about the money." And I said with a little smile, "Yeah, okay, suppose you're the most selfish, greedy, egotistical person in the world. All you care about is money." And I asked him a simple question: how are you going to make it? Well, you better have stuff that customers want to buy. You better have suppliers if you want to stay in business or trying to make you better. You need employees who have some commitment to what you're doing, and you at least have communities that are not going to run you out. And if you do those things and you get lucky, you might make some money. So this idea that the stakeholder idea is what you see in some of the pushback today. That's a way to kill profits. It's exactly the opposite. It's the way you make money. And so those things go together. So it has to be stakeholders and financiers. It's a little bit different. People get the idea that customers, suppliers, employees, etc., are important. What they don't understand sometimes is that they're interconnected. What you do for customers depends on what you do for the others. How you create value for employees depends on how you create value with the others. No stakeholders stands alone here. They have to be integrated, and they have their interests, which are different, have to be. I'm kind of an amateur musician, and I would say they have to be harmonized because notes and harmony are different, but they sound good together. So the idea is how do you get these interests, which can conflict, going in the same direction? The second thing that is hard to get people to understand about the stakeholder idea is we're so influenced by economists, and they typically think about business as a set of transactions, one after another. I want to ask you to think about business as a set of relationships, as not just one-off transactions. I mean, those things exist, but if we're going to think about how to build a great business, People build a great business based on the set of relationships that they're able to put together. And when you think about relationships, you have to think about, there's a presumption it's going to continue. If there's no presumption that it's going to continue, it's not a relationship, it's a transaction. You think about your personal life. It's not it's not somebody you want to be with for a long time. It's it's maybe we might call those tender moments or whatever they are. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with those, but it's not a relationship. Relationships, people care about both parties. You have to care in business about your stakeholders. I tell executives, you got to love your stakeholders, because if you don't, you won't really understand them, and you won't create as much value as you could. And of course, you don't keep score all the time when you're in a relationship. My wife and I have been married for 47 years. She works here at Darden. If I were to go down to her office and say, "Hey, babe, I think the score is you're up 3 after 47 years," I'm pretty sure I know what the answer would be. She's a second-degree black belt in Taekwondo. I've had my hips replaced, so I can't really run. It would not be healthy for me. Why? You don't have to keep score all the time. Sometimes you have to end relationships. Sometimes companies have to end their relationships with stakeholders, and that's a painful process. But you don't keep score every day. So it's purpose and profits, it's stakeholders and financiers. It's thinking about societal issues as well as market issues. Businesses don't have to think about every societal issue, but they have to think about the ones that can be affected by their business model. Oil and gas companies need to think about the environment and what they do. If they don't, they're going to get criticized out of existence. Um, uh, Car manufacturers need to think about issues around environment and employment because there's so much. And so it's not just market issues, it's societal issues. It's the integration of societal and market issues. Purpose and profits, stakeholders and financiers, societal issues and market issues, human complexity, and being narrowly economic, which we can be. I mean, human beings can be pretty nasty, but that's not all we are. Anybody who's ever been in love, anybody who's ever had a child, knows we're capable of a lot more than that. And so we need to see people in business as fully complexly human, not just as economic actors who want to maximize their own short-term self-interest. And finally, we need to figure out how to put business and ethics together. Um, when I tell people I teach business ethics, they have to manage not to laugh. They say things like business ethics, oxymoron, two words, you put them together, contradiction, like jumbo shrimp or American football is one of my favorites. You can think about that. Um, or business ethics must be a short course, or I didn't know business had any, or I was in a bar in Copenhagen not too long ago, and someone said business ethics. Oh yeah, that's a theoretical subject, isn't it? And as long as business ethics is a joke, we have some work to do. Part of the reason I think is that we misunderstand business, which I've just tried to give you a different way to understand it, but we also misunderstand ethics. We have this idea that ethics is kind of angels and organ music, that we play on the Sabbath. And I'm not trying to say that religion is unimportant. Of course it's important. But ethics is more than that. Yes, it's personal. We see it as personal and private. My ethics is mine. Azita's ethics is hers. Your ethics is yours. It's private. It's relative to each person. And what's right for me may not be right for you. The other sort of idea that isn't really useful is it's only about right and wrong and good and bad. That's all we have to think about is decisions, right, wrong, good, bad. It's only about judgment. And the other issue that unfortunately is not all that helpful is to think that how philosophers have traditionally defined ethics in these sort of four major traditions is kind of all we need to think about. That if we think about principles, if we think about consequences, if we think about character, if we think about relational ethics or relationships, and we kind of check those four, one or more of those four boxes, that's how we do ethical reasoning. Well, there's a different view about ethics I want to suggest. Yeah, it's about ideals. It's about our personal and religious ideals, our best self, thinking of ourselves as at our best. It's also very practical. It's about how we're going to live. It's about the kind of relationships that we have. It's not just this idealized thing. And sometimes people will say, well, business is about making money, and ethics is about kind of doing good, and those things don't mix. But what we want in our lives, we want our lives to make sense. Not only if there's this gap between how we live and what our ideals are, that's psychological material for trauma and distress. Another way to say this is, people tell me all the time, well, look, Ed, I got my ethics. I have to make the decisions. I have to look myself in the mirror. I have to live with myself. And that's true. You do have to live with yourself. Unfortunately, we have to live with you too. And so it's not just about you. Ethics is personal, and there's that word again, and it's interpersonal at the same time. The reason ethics is hard is not just because we may not know ourselves, which is important, but it's that we got to figure out how we can live together. If everybody's sitting around doing their own private ethics, there's going to be a lot of conflict, etc. In fact, one of the reasons that that we do have, I think, such moral conflict in society today, is people think that it's only about their private conception. Now, look, everybody can have their own private conception of ethics, but we got to figure out how we can reason together, how we can live together. So, for instance, let's suppose I'm an evangelical Christian, and I'm going to pick on Azita again because I can see her on my screen. And let's suppose she's a worms and dust Darwinian. She thinks that's just what it is. And so we're going to have a conversation about something that's important to us, an ethical issue. And I start giving her evangelical Christian reasons, and she starts replying with worms and dust Darwinian reasons. Guess what? We're not going anywhere. We're each trying to convert each other to our private conception. What we have to do is find some reasons that we can agree on. She might say to me, "Look, you don't you think people should not be slaves, and that they need control over their bodies, because if they don't have control over their bodies, um, you know, um, you're a slave, and um, and that's something that fits with my evangelical point of view, if I had one, and uh, we might say, look, um, there's a principle that we both agree on, and it's about you shouldn't kill innocents. Now the problem, of course, is that those two principles conflict when there's a technology that makes safe abortion on demand a real option. So it's not just that, yeah, we can find principles we can agree on, and sometimes those principles conflict. So ethics is about ideals, and it's practical. It's both personal and interpersonal at the same time. And that's part of what makes it hard. It's both our private conceptions and the stuff we can agree on in sort of public or civic space. And another take on this is to say, well, is ethics objective or is it subjective? And if you follow what I've been trying to outline here, you would say, yeah, it's both at the same time. It's subjective and objective. It's intersubjective. It's what we can all agree about, and that might change over time. But that's the best we've got. And these traditions are important. But other tools, like thinking about how we have hard conversations, thinking about um, what good reasoning is and critical thinking, those things are important too. So if I said there are these 6 things to think about in ethics, it's about ideals and it's practical about how we live. It's about personal and interpersonal at the same time. It's about private conceptions and as public civic space. It's about subjective and objective or intersubjective. It's about traditions and other tools. It's about the decisions, right, wrong, good, bad, but it's also about how we frame it. If we frame a decision in a particular way, that'll give us the choices between right, wrong, good, bad. And what language does when we use language is it frames our world. It frames how we see things. And decision making is important, judgment's important, but so is framing. And we don't often think about that. So if we take this different view of business and ethics, and now let's think about how technology plays into this. And I want to give you an example that hopefully you can help me with, and then talk about a couple of other things. So I have this idea about property that I've called it the stuff theory of property. You know, this is my stuff. It's not yours. I got it. You don't. Right? And property evolves and has a long, complicated philosophical history from Locke and others, and goes back a long ways. But it's basically about stuff. It's my stuff, not your stuff. Um, there's ironically, if you have ever heard of the comedian George Carlin, he has a wonderful little bit on stuff, and that's probably where I got this from. Uh, and it worked for a long time. But now, in the digital age, we've invented technologies so that the stuff I got is a complicated set of zeros and ones, right? And once stuff becomes zeros and ones, and we have the ability to, I've got it, but you can have it too, at essentially zero cost. The stuff theory of property kind of breaks down. And so, what do we have? Well, we have copyright law, and this idea is about intellectual property. But I don't know many people that are very happy with that, except maybe copyright lawyers or intellectual property lawyers. Why? It's enormously complex. It now has to deal with governments and all kinds of complexities here. And the fact that I can write a book, or someone can write a book and you can have it, I mean, essentially for free. Um, it creates a lot of good in the world. The fact that we have the technology now so that, I have access to the world's knowledge right here in my hand, that's a very powerful thing. And it can create a lot of good in the world. So how does this process work? Well, look, we have some cases and we build some principles or some ideas about consequences or relationship, etc., as a to that we generalize from. Okay, from a lot of cases, we build a sort of basic don't lie, steal, cheat, and now we have a new case, and now the question is, do the old rules, do the old principles solve the new case, or do we need to revise the principles? And this mutual adjustment of principles with cases is the way ethics works, the way ethics conversations in societies work. This is 25-cent word is called reflective equilibrium from the great philosopher John Rawls. Now, where do these new cases come from? Well, they come from new groups being empowered in society. We have to rethink voting when we decide that, women or people of color can vote. And we use some of the principles, but we revise them to say, well, wait, it's not just white land-owning farmers who are able to do this. Uh, and they come from when we experience different ways to live in our global world. Look, there are lots of ways to do ethics. I've learned over the years that as I've traveled around the world, I've become more and more certain about fewer and fewer things, because there are lots of ways that we can live good lives. And a lot of our new cases come from technology. They come from stuff that, we didn't think about before. I would say I learned ethics at my grandmother's knee. In the 1950s in Georgia, 1960s in Georgia, we had no conversations about abortion on demand. Wasn't feasible. We had no conversations about end of life technology. We had no conversations about point-to-point networks and things like, the old technology of Napster and those kinds of things, or whether downloading something from the internet from a site, was ethical or not. We had no conversations about AIs or computers or any of that kind of stuff. And so the moral rules, if you like, or the principles or the way we think about ethics has evolved without much of the current technology that drives our lives. And that's not to say that technology violates that. It's to say that sometimes, we need to evaluate those things in a different way. Now, the problem is reflective equilibrium is a very slow process. We still haven't figured out how to deal with don't kill innocents, and people need to have control of their bodies, and we go back and forth on those things. We sometimes think there's a compromise. Well, maybe it's 26 weeks, or maybe it's not a person until a certain it's viable outside the womb, or other people think that it's a person at conception, and we still don't have a kind of agreement, an intersubjective agreement about those things. So that's still a really live issue. This process is slow. The problem when you apply it to technology is technology is generally fast. Our ability to innovate in technology outstrips our ability to reason together about how we're going to live. And often we don't think about all the consequences. So I want to suggest that there are at least three levels of evaluation that we need to think through. The first, I wrote an old paper way back in the 70s on technology assessment, and I went back and read that recently. I thought, well, maybe there's a germ of an idea here, and you can decide whether this makes any sense or not. The first thing we have to do is, I think what we do, we have to look at the intentional effects. What are the intentional effects of something like self-driving cars or AI, or those kinds of things? And those are some of the things that we're trying to encourage people to look at. And many tech firms have actually hired ethicists to help them think through that. But there's another level here, and that's what I would call second order effects, where the unintended consequences. And we're often, I mean, you see in the conversations today the unintended consequences of social media. I have a former student who's uh, uh, part of a movement. She's a mom now, part of a movement to get cell phones out of schools, because she thinks that being on screen all the time, is not healthy for middle school kids, for sure. And so there are often unintended effects. I mean, I don't think anybody who figured out the technology that gives us social media platforms understood what a lot of the effects of those things were. I'm not sure they were. It was easy to have forecast those things, but or certainly if you forecasted what it was going to be like for us individually, I don't think they could have forecasted what it would do to politics, what it would do to the media in industry, etc. So there are, with almost any technology, unintended consequences, and we need to be more, we need to get better at figuring out what those are. You do that through thinking about scenarios and by talking to lots of different stakeholders that are there, not just the users and not just people inside a tech company, but we have to cast a net much broader. We have to cast a net to think about people who maybe are marginal to the technology, who may not use it, to think through what's the effect going to be on them. So there's intentional effects, there's second order effects, and I want to call them third order effects. The third order effects are a little more subtle. They're the kind of effects that say, what's this technology going to do to us, both our self-image of who we are and our ability to form relationships with others? What's it going to do to the quality of our lives as moral beings? And that's again a step that I think is often lacking, certainly lacking in the sort of policy world, but in my experience, it's lacking in the business world as well. When we think about what technologies and how they're going to be made. For instance, um, if the relationships I have are primarily mediated by screens, how am I going to be able to develop the skills to form intimate, close, personal relationships face to face? It may turn out that the technology makes that more difficult. Now, I'm not arguing that that's the reason to ban the technology. I'm no Luddite at all. Christ, I have enough gadgets right here in my office to more than I know how to work with. But then we have to think about what we do to try to mitigate those effects, or to try to try to turn them into something that's more useful, rather than just have them done to us. And that's the trick here, is to take our agency seriously with technology, to take our moral agency seriously with technology. This isn't, social media doesn't do anything to us unless we let it. And so thinking about our own agency here, our own sort of moral responsibility for our lives and the lives of those close to us, who we have to, deal with as well, is what's important. So I think this mysterious relationship between business, ethics, and technology is in part there because we have an idea of both business and ethics that's not very useful. And we often give up our agency when it comes to technology. Let me stop there and see. I've gone a little bit longer than I wanted to, but let me stop there and see if there are outrageous expressions of "that's the worst talk I've ever heard," or questions, or
No,
whatever
that
you
was the
have.
best talk I've ever heard. You've given me
Well,
so much to think about. I have a lot of questions, but I'm not going to ask them. We have two questions that I'd like to read to you. Hugh Comer says there seems to be an inevitability about technological progress that makes it impossible to put brakes on. How can we get ahead of ethical issues when they have their own momentum?
that's a great question. And I would go back to kind of what I said at the end. We can't, I don't have any magic for this, but I know what we can't do. We can't give up our agency. There may be a kind of inevitability about progress in technology. And personally, I think, for instance, the only way we're going to uh, 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 escape essentially burning up is through technological progress. But we can't give up our agency here. We can't, and I would say again, because I'm an enormously pro-business person here. Uh, we have a principle we try to teach our students, which is critique through creation. If you've got to critique something, if you don't like the way a technology is going, something, then invent something different. Invent something that's better. And if we could take this sort of entrepreneurial mindset, uh, and maybe this is a bad analogy for this talk, but clone it for everybody, you know, then we could see, yeah, okay, so here's the technology, here are these consequences. I'm going to figure out how to do it better without those consequences. And again, I think we have to get much better at not accepting inevitability when that means forgetting about our agency. And I don't mean by that, I hope you understand, I don't mean become a Luddite, but I mean embracing technological progress so much that we try to improve it and make it better.
Great, thank you. So Rob Straker, I apologize, Rob, if I butchered that
Yes.
last name. He says,
Nope, that's
great to
right.
see
He's
you,
a
Ed.
former student.
All right. You're an awesome, you are as awesome a teacher as ever. I've been helping companies develop and use AI responsibly and find they focus primarily on protecting themselves from harm. There's little consideration of impact on individuals or society at large. Beyond what you've shared today, what practical tips would you suggest to help them expand their perspective?
Well, first, Rob, it's nice to connect with you again. First of all, what I would say is, you really want to protect yourself from harm. You better figure out how your AI is going to affect other stakeholders, because that's where the real harm is going to come from. So I think you could start with that and say, and then it's most of business ethics is about preventing harm. And what people don't understand is that, look, uh, it's about how business benefits people as well. If I walk into a room and I say, okay, folks, we've got an ethics issue we need to deal with. We really have to deal with this now. There's not a soul in the room who's thought, oh, somebody must have created something really cool that makes our lives better. Or we identify ethics with some harm. We certainly do in business. But if business gets credit for the harm, and it should also get credit for the benefits. So I would think, Rob, if you can get companies to just do a more complete stakeholder analysis and engagement, because oftentimes what executives think a stakeholder's view is not their view. And oftentimes you have to also, get them to try to tell you what they see as some potential harms and potential benefits. If you can do that, I think you can really help them get away from just the kind of cover your ass thing that's there. My experience has been when I've been able to get them to think just a little bit broader, starting with where they are, and say, hey, if you really want to cover your ass, you better pay attention to what this group wants. And that leads you down a path, I think, that gets them to focus on the outside, because so many times they're focusing on what's happening inside the company walls. I hope that makes sense.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. Nick Dungan says, you said social media doesn't do anything to us unless we let it. How can we, as a generation, work to break through this new obsession with technology?
Well, that's a good question, Nick, and I don't have a great answer with that, except we got to invent new forms of it. We got to figure out what's not what doesn't work here, and invent new forms for it. I'm not someone who thinks we have to regulate it. Regulation can play a part. Often regulation plays a part when we're not smart enough to figure out how to do it in any other way. And the problem with regulation, of course, is it's one size fits all. That's what it has to be in a democracy. And with business and technologies, one size doesn't ever fit all.
Mhm.
So my hope here, and this is ideal, is that we rely on the entrepreneurial process and we encourage the entrepreneurial process. We encourage, this is going to sound real weird, we're going to encourage people to take our technology and make it better. And I think that's a tricky thing.
Mm,
Great
Great.
question.
Thank you. Richard David says, Professor Freeman, you are a gem. I missed you at Darden by a couple of years, unfortunately. You quoted Hobbes in the beginning. How do we think about people who have gained huge power and influence in business and politics based largely on technology, who are red in tooth and claw?
Yeah, Richard, I'm not, again, these are great questions. I'm not sure I have an answer for that. I do think that paying attention to this new version of business, paying attention to this sort of pragmatist view of ethics will ultimately beat the hell out of people who only think it's about competition. Now, how do you deal with people that are power hungry? That's the way they see the world, and are charismatic and are able to convince other people I don't know the answer to that. I don't want to live that way, and I don't really want to live in a society where that's the main way we think about each other. Um, I think we have to find sets of relationships uh, where they're not like that. Most businesses are not like that, and that's the good news, and that's why I'm so optimistic about the future, is I actually think we can invent our way out of these problems. There are always going to be people who, in your words, have gained huge power and influence, and that's what they care about. They care about the power and influence. There are also people who have a lot of influence uh, who don't care about that. They have a lot of influence because they're kind. They're kind-hearted. They're trying to make the world better. And I don't think having power and influence itself isn't a problem. It's what you do with it and why you have it. And so, I've been lucky to meet a lot of CEOs who were powerful and who were absolutely as committed as I am to trying to make the world a better place with their companies. And those are the people I want to lift up and talk about, whether it's Roy Vagelos at Merck, whether it's John Mackey at Whole Foods, whether it's uh, uh, the Jim Burke at Johnson and Johnson. There are lots of folks like this. Paul Pullman at Unilever. There are a lot of these folks out there, and that's where I'm going to put my effort is in dealing with them. I don't know what to do with the other
Mhm.
people. I wish I
Yeah.
did, and hopefully you do.
Thank you so much. I hope we can bring you back. We've got a lot of questions and we got about 6 minutes, so I'll try
Okay.
to get through them. We have an
Okay, great.
anonymous question. I feel like we're largely unaware of when we're compromising our moral agency in the presence of technology, especially free technology. Can we be more mindful and how?
I think we can. Mindfulness is actually a good way to do it. We show our students the Milgram obedience experiments, where you know uh, we found 65% of people would essentially electrocute a nice guy when told to do so by legitimate authority. That makes them more mindful. I think we got to do a much better job of doing that in schools.
Yeah.
Uh, Teaching people to be agents, not just to obey authority.
Yeah, great. Joseph Carson says, how does the industrial exemption impact scope and implementation of engineering ethics?
I'm going to show my ignorance here. I'm not sure what the industrial exemption is here.
Okay, all right. So we'll wait and come back. So Joseph, if you can elaborate on that on the last question, we can do that for you. Craig Pfeiffer says, can you say more about your explanation that business is not primarily interested in making money? It seems like a given technology is often not developed much in the private sector past the point that it is marketable. Put the other way, don't businesses often develop technology with ethical challenges because the technology is profitable?
Well, look, profitability matters. Again, you can't be a viable business without that. I'm not willing to make the generalizations that you're making here, only because my experience is that, um, most entrepreneurs that I know, I'm sure there are exceptions, um, are trying to change the world somehow. I'm sure things get put on the shelf because they're not profitable. I'm certain of that. I've certainly seen that too. Um, but rarely, I think, do ethical challenges just get ignored. If they do get ignored, it's bad management because there's nowhere to hide in today's world. There's nowhere to hide them. So I like to think that nowhere to hide them. Executives live in a fishbowl. And yeah, it's tiresome. It's hard to do because somebody watching you all the time. But I think um, it's hard to ignore those ethical challenges
Mhm.
today. Though I know you're partially correct as well.
Great, thank you. Michael O'Brien says C.S. Lewis, in his essay Abolition of Man, made a general distinction between making a tool to help man's faculties and making one that subjects them. Instead of increasing his agency, the tool makes him a lifelong customer, so to speak. Could you speculate on how intellectual property and human agency could be respected?
I there have been a variety of schemes that people have proposed. I'm not a fan really of any of them because I just haven't seen one that doesn't have much doesn't have problems. Um, I think that's an issue we really have to deal with because there's a the most important things in our lives are going to be intellectual property. Now, I don't know that the even idea of intellectual property makes sense. Property of stuff makes sense. Maybe there's a different way to live so that um, we can make a living with what we now call intellectual property, and we don't have to give up our agency. And I just don't know what that is. We need more people to think about that, people smarter than I am. I think, you've rightly, I think C.S. Lewis was in a sense right. And part of that is increasing our sense of agency so that we don't let life happen to us, that we become the authors of our own story, rather than let others write that. I don't mean that in an individualist sense. I mean it in the sense of self and the set of relationships I'm enmeshed in. We need to increase our sense of agency, especially for those who feel like they don't have any. Because look, if I think I don't have any agency, if I don't have any hope, then what's to stop me from doing really desperate things? We need to make business an institution of hope. We need to make education, we need to return that to being an education of hope. I dare say we need government to become an institution of hope. I'm just not optimistic about that.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go back to Joseph Carson's explanation of industrial exemption. He says it's why few engineers are licensed and thereby under jurisdiction of state board for their professional
Okay, got
acts.
it, got it. Thanks. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of licensing by state boards of those kinds of things. Um, we know that does some good stuff, but it also leads to higher prices and those kinds of things. It leads in part to the healthcare crisis by restricting the number of doctors. It's not that the terms of licensing are unimportant. It's that when it restricts the numbers that make it difficult. I think, and therefore, oftentimes licensing ethics, whether it's in cosmetology or engineering, uh, people don't take they don't deal with the real underlying ethics issues. They deal with like in legal ethics, don't chase the ambulances, don't sleep with the clients, those kinds of ethical things. They don't deal with the sort of bigger ethics issues. I think in engineering, we need to deal with the big ethics issues here.
Right. Thank you so much. So we're at 12:01, but I have three questions. So I will
Sure.
leave it up to you. Is it all right for us to
Yeah,
go
it's fine.
a little longer? Excellent.
Fine.
Thank you. An anonymous question. What skill set should be enhanced to navigate the ethics of technology? You emphasize moral agency, but are there other personal skill sets that could be
Yeah,
enhanced?
great question. Look, I'm a real fan of the humanities. I really think we learn to be better people by reading literature, by engaging in creative arts, by understanding our history. And these are not things that are in business schools very often. We actually have a group of us here that see ourselves as the humanities faculty in business. Those skills that you learn in the humanities, critical thinking, practical reasoning, paying attention to particularity and detail, those are the things that help us see ourselves as agents and see ourselves as enmeshed in a set of relationships and begin to have our own ideals about trying to remake the world for our children. I don't think I was a math major. I was a math nerd. I didn't learn that stuff as a math nerd. I learned it in philosophy and literature and those kinds of things. And I'm still learning.
Right. Right, thank you. Velan Shanmugan says, thank you for a great discussion. Do you think the general public is less likely to consider their own agency because they do not understand how technology works? Do you think encouraging a greater level of education towards technology could incentivize, I guess, greater individual
Well, I
agency?
think that's a great idea. I think that's right, but not if it's just understand the programming. In other words, we have to look at understanding the technology in its sort of not only intentional environment, but in addition to the second order and third order effects that are there. In other words, I would say we got to understand technology ethics, if you like, and get people to understand that better, rather
Right.
than after the fact. I just watched a documentary on FTX and Bitcoin and crypto. I had absolutely no idea how crypto worked, and neither did any of my students I showed this to. And it would have been better if we had understood that and the ethics before, all of the bad stuff happened. So I think you've got a great idea here. You should start a company to make that happen.
Great, thank you. An anonymous question regarding ethics and finding common ground with others who may have contrasting opinions. How do we ensure possible compromise is one made by both parties and not one party feeling intimidated, settling, and therefore potentially conceding values that may be important to them? I feel that there are many instances in business where smaller groups are strong-armed
Mhm.
into accepting the less than ideal outcome in this way.
Yeah, one of the big controversies in stakeholder theory is how do you deal with marginalized
Mm.
stakeholders, and seeing them as fully human, as we often see ourselves. I think that's a great question. Many years ago, I was doing a session with some Japanese managers, and they didn't speak much English. I spoke no Japanese, and so we were kind of playing, me Tarzan, you Jane for a couple of days. And um, I said, so what happens when you can't come to an agreement with a stakeholder? And they said, well, we talked more until we could find an agreement. And I said, yeah, but you try, but you just can't do it. You just can't find an agreement. And they said, well, we would go out and talk more until we find an agreement. And so, I think stakeholder theory works best when I don't see myself as just narrowly self-interested, where I take some responsibility for the welfare of other stakeholders. Not complete, because people are responsible for themselves, but we have to see business again as a relational idea. And in relationships, you got to care about the other person. And if you care about somebody, you're not trying to put one over on them. And I think that's a better way to think about business and management, etc. That's a real problem.
Julie Cook says, thank you. This was an hour well spent. I and my work am better for having attended, and I couldn't agree more. So thank you
Thank you
so
very
much.
much.
It was an absolute pleasure listening and learning with you. For those of you in the audience that have stayed longer, thank you so much for being here. Don't forget The Power of And, my latest favorite book, and your podcast. So thank you again. For being here. And I hope that we can bring you back at some point. The OEC's director, Dr. Rosalind Byrne, who's been on with
All
us
right.
as well this
Yeah.
morning. Thank you so much, Rosalind, for this opportunity. And our coordinator, Tracy Marshalls, that you met early on. And to all of you for joining us, thank you so much. Have an awesome Friday, fantastic weekend. And we have so much to think about right now and reflect on. So thank you for this opportunity. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks,
Thank you very
Dr.
much.
Freeman.
Take care.
Yep, bye-bye.